Hi, welcome back or welcome if this is your first time here to my little corner on the internet. So, this video is actually part 2 of the series for parents of black children. The point of this video and the series overall is the same as always, to provide you with the tools that you need to raise your child in a way that allows their true genius to flow. The overarching aim is and will always be black liberation for all of us through education and intentional child rearing practices. So, in the previous video, we spoke about identifying or creating a child rearing philosophy and why you should do that. So, this video follows on from that. So, in this video, we're going to be talking about understanding the field. So, the field, as I said before, is the social space, and we're also going to be talking about the true purpose of mass education, why and how it has been designed to kind of keep us limited, and how we can use it for our advantage, essentially, right? So, understanding it will enable us to navigate it intentionally, or enable you to navigate it intentionally based on the philosophy that you are developing, but towards this goal of kind of our collective sustained liberation. So what we're going to do is revisit the questions that I asked in the last video and then discuss how you can integrate this into your life and use it to shape your child's development. So don't forget that you can book a consultation with me at any time on the website if you want some direct support to implement this. And you can also join The Village, which is an online community for parents and professionals on this journey. So let's get started. We need a revolution for how African children all over the world are educated. This should be our priority. I support parents and professionals to unlock black children's genius and allow them to thrive no matter where they are. My name is Andrea Yanka. I am an educator, researcher, activist, and an African woman. If you want to know how you can lay strong foundations for black children, then come on this journey with me, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. So, as I said before, the rationale for this video is about understanding the field, right? And understanding the field is important. The term field comes from Bourdieu's ideas, which I discussed in the previous video, and I'll probably talk about it over and over and over again because it's really, really important to all the work that we're doing here, right? So the field is a social space that has been intentionally created, right? And then within those fields or within those social spaces, there are spaces, and then there are spaces within those spaces, and these are all called fields, right? So you have fields and subfields, etc. So each field has its own rules, and the rules is what's referred to as the habitus, right? So some people know the rules or the habitus of the field, and they have the keys to access the fields and subfields, which kind of become more and more exclusive as you get into it. And those keys are basically what we call capital. So it's very likely that a lot of us or your child will be the first to enter a field. And this tends to be like the first black person in a particular space in a particular field. But ultimately, when you are in that space, you are up against people whose parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles, etc., have had access to that space for generations, right? And therefore, they know the rules, they know more of the rules, and they have more capital than you. The point of understanding this really is so that you know how to navigate those spaces effectively and to kind of gain other forms of capital. Now, the people in these fields sometimes on purpose, but sometimes not, don't tell you the rules, right? For those that don't do it on purpose, they kind of just assume that everybody knows. They just feel like, oh, everybody knows this information. And we kind of call it taking for granted knowledge, right? So because of colonial history, the field has been set or designed without many of us. The rules have been evolving for the past 500 years and have done so with the intention or with the view of us as half human, as servants, etc., even in our own lands, right? So even in Africa, the Caribbean, whatever, that's still how we were positioned. So a lot of the rules of the field in this kind of age of information is freely and publicly available, but the majority of us, and especially young people, are not really using the internet to do that. And I'm actually really sad to see how many young black people, especially since I've been in Ghana, kind of spend their time twerking and doing all this other nonsense on social media when this information is so freely available. And I don't even think it's going to be freely available forever. So we have to be really careful about collating that information and disseminating that information to our children. So as this information is freely available, actually, you still have to go looking for it, and some people don't even know where to find that information. There is also a lot of information that isn't freely available, and they are kind of trapped behind paywalls which of course is intentional to kind of maintain and keep power within certain fields. So that's why, although my content is pro-Black, a lot of the theories that I've mentioned so far are not necessarily from Black theorists, because at this stage we're really talking about people who live or come from those fields and the information that they are giving us, right? So it's almost like we're going in there, taking that knowledge and information and bringing it to you, or rather, I'm going in there, bringing that knowledge information and bringing it to you. And as I said, this information is generally freely available, but it is quite difficult to digest. So doing that allows us to kind of understand what we're up against. And with the realization that the foundation was set without our consent, of course, and with that awareness, we can navigate it and teach our children to navigate it appropriately. So in this series, the field that I'm talking about, of course, is education, but the theory kind of applies to all fields. And actually, when Bourdieu first started talking about it, he started to talk about it in terms of art. Ultimately, the whole point is that this whole idea of habitus, capital, and field is effective in creating this reality that we live in today. All of this is effectively the manifestation of all of this is effectively the manifestation of other people, and I believe that we can reshape it, and we should reshape it and be intentional in doing so. So let's look at the history of education for what it really is, right? Education and formal education has always existed. It just looked different in different eras of time, right? It didn't always happen in a classroom with 30 children, because actually that's a pretty ineffective way of educating anybody. So prior to the introduction of mass education, the general way that people were educated was through their community, right? And people would participate in community events from as soon as they could really walk, right? And they would be educated in that way. They'll be provided with the tools and resources that they need. If necessary, they'll be sent somewhere to learn how to read or be taught how to read by their family members or members in that community, right? There are literally hundreds of videos on social media everywhere talking about the history of mass education, the reasons that it was invented, and how it has been used to suppress information for generations, right? And how the kind of purpose of it was to create generations and generations of compliant worker robots or worker bees who kind of lack creativity and critical thinking. Paulo Freire, who is one of my favorite writers on education, talks about how mass education has been used by the elite to silence and domesticate the masses, right? That's a direct quote, because the elite know that without this, their power is being threatened, right? That comes from this book, Education from Critical Consciousness. Fabulous book. If you are interested in education, definitely check it out. So I'm going to go on and read a couple of sections from this book. And this section, he's talking about the importance of critical education rather than mass education, right? So he says that critical education would basically enable people to emerge into a state of awareness, and then they would discover that the elite regard them with contempt. In reaction, they tend, whenever possible, to respond aggressively. The elite, in turn, frightened at the threat to the legitimacy of their power, attempt by force or by paternalism to silence or domesticate the masses and try and impede the process of popular emergence. So what he's saying here is that when people actually begin to understand that the elite are putting these systems in place to domesticate and silence them, they respond, right? They respond in a way where they try and reclaim that power back. And throughout history, they have done that, and and the elite have kicked back. And one of the ways that they have done that is through mass education. So I just want to point out that Freire's ideas were so threatening to the elite that he was literally imprisoned and exiled from Brazil for his writings and teachings. So he also goes on to talk about how the middle class sustains this, right? Because they feel that one day they will become the elite. So they will happily play along, not realizing that the system is not designed for them to ever become the elite. Generally speaking, there is the odd one that will kind of make it, but that's necessary to keep the illusion going. So people have this view that, oh, that one guy made it, so I can make it because the system works. The reality is that the middle class are more equipped to bring down the system because they have the resources, the knowledge, the information, the skills, but they won't because they believe that they'll benefit from it one day. And that is one of the big issues that we have within our communities, where people are almost willing to go along with the inequalities if it's not too bad on their side, because they feel like once they make it, they will also benefit from that. So he goes on to say, and I'm reading from page 33 in case you're ever interested in this book, that our traditional curriculum, disconnected from life, centered on words, emptied of the reality that they are meant to represent, lacking in concrete activity, could never develop critical consciousness. Indeed, its own naive dependence on high sounding phrases, reliance on rote, and tendency towards abstractness actually intensified our naivety. So effectively what he's saying here is the lack of practical application of education and the kind of intentional nature of that basically contributes to this whole what we call massification of education that domesticates and silences the masses. Yeah, so furthermore, he's talking about this naivety that we develop because everything is so abstract and there's no practical knowledge. So we can all be super highly educated, which is a big problem in Africa, but there is no application, there is no effects, there's no positive effect of that education, and that is intentional. So, yeah. So ultimately, what my whole work is about is raising that critical consciousness, right? And I'll go into more detail about my work in a broader sense as time goes on, because I'm just getting like my ducks in a row. And I think I'll do a whole teaching on Freire one day. But this idea is also discussed by many people. So as I said, there are literally hundreds of videos all over social media talking about it. There's ones about that famous Rockefeller quote talking about how he doesn't want a nation of thinkers, but a nation of workers. There are a lot of conversations around the school to prison pipeline. And, you know, I'm actually really surprised because since I've been in Ghana, I've visited quite a few schools, senior high schools, where they pack all the children into dorms like prisons, right? 100 or so children in one dorm room. And schools in Africa are following the same blueprint left by colonial people, right? I try not to use colonial masters because they're not my master. But ultimately, the whole point I'm making is mass education as we know it now was introduced in Ghana, in Africa. So basically, mass education as we know it was introduced in Ghana, in Africa, over a lot of kind of previously colonized nations by colonizers to train a certain amount of enslaved people to manage their affairs, even in their absence. And to be honest, this trickles through our political system even onto today, but that's a whole other story for a whole other day. There's only so much that I can say in one video, and there's only so many things that I can discuss on YouTube without kind of putting my own life at risk. But these are things that we discuss more in detail in the community and in my one-to-ones. Yeah, so if you want to find out more about that or discuss this in more detail, of course, you can book a session with me. But the whole point is that once we kind of have an understanding of this, we can be intentional in building systems, establishing systems to create a better tomorrow for our children, our children's children, and our kind of collective consciousness. The whole point, though, is that we have to navigate this crazy world. And to do that, we have to be intentional and kind of support each other. So in the previous video, I asked you some questions that would help you to identify or construct your parenting philosophy. And we're going to go back to those. I'm going to base this video on kind of my own answers. And if you'd like to see the responses, there's a link below that will take you to an article containing my responses, which kind of makes up my whole philosophy and all the work that I do, but in a kind of diluted version because of the things that I said earlier. But over time, when everything is ready to be launched, you will find out. So the first question was, what words do you associate with the word child? Now, this question is important because it literally frames the way that you were looking at the child that's standing in front of you. When your child was on their way to you, either in utero or however else they came into your life, you had ideas about what it meant to be responsible for another person, right? And you had ideas about what it means to be a child. You had ideas about what that looks like or what that should look like. So what are the words that you came up with? My words, by the way, are competent, capable, purpose, destiny, and new energy, which sounds a bit weird. But ultimately, I believe that every generation basically comes into the world with a different energy, and that energy is needed collectively for the world to move forward in general. This is kind of demonstrated in how we break up generations generally. So you've got the silent generation, which were people who were children of parents who lived through the Great Depression, and they were called the silent generation because they didn't really speak out on social issues and a lot of the things that were happening at the time. Then the next generation were the baby boomers, who were credited with the foundation of technological advancements. Gen X kind of built on those technological advancements. They were around when the internet was conceived, but it wasn't as popular, right? Then you've got millennials, people like me, right, who were around when the internet became more mainstream, but we had a life before that. We had things like dial-up internet, right? And then you've got Gen Z, who were the first generation to really grow up with tech integrated into everyday life. But they had to deal with things like cyberbullying, etc., for the first time. But for a lot of them, they still had the opportunities to play outside and kind of have to come home before dark type of energy. And I think they're probably the last generation to really experience this. Then you've got Gen Alpha, who for me were children literally born with iPads attached to their hands. They are children of millennials, etc. So each generation fundamentally kind of misunderstands the other. And I think this is really significant because of colonization, right? We stopped seeing children as the ones with the God-given gifts, knowledge, etc., to usher in a new era. And instead, we've been socialized for a while now to kind of see children as, I think since the time of the silent generation, to kind of suppress and see children as good children when we kind of suppress and make them conform, right? So this also means that we don't flow with children's natural development because again we've been socialized into seeing much of what is pretty much just normal human development as something that's wrong with the child. And this has caused an increase in things like anxiety, depression, and to a certain extent ADHD. Yeah, so for many children, it's actually all of these conditions are actually just a normal response to the pretty unnatural ways in which we have been socialized into living, right? This is because of the significant increase in screen time among younger generations, the fact that we want children to sit down and be quiet, removed a lot of outdoor play spaces that allow children to burn all of that kind of chaotic energy, the amount of chemicals in our food and water, the list is literally endless. So ultimately, children are having normal, natural reactions to the messed up way of the world, and we are being told there's something fundamentally wrong with them, and then kind of just medicating all the children, right? So being intentional also covers that, and the most effective time to do that, or to start, is during early childhood. Early childhood, that's a period between 0 and 8, effectively sets the foundation, right? It's almost like the depth of the well of knowledge and understanding that your child will draw from for the rest of their life. After this, between sort of 8 and 12 to 14 ish, they're kind of implementing these things by themselves and need your guidance to do so. So, this is a good time to kind of be more strict and do all that kind of stuff, and help them to integrate these lessons on their own. So when puberty hits, which used to start from around 14, but it's actually becoming sooner and sooner and sooner. But ultimately, it's a time where when children become quite rebellious, right? And children are meant to be rebellious, right? Their childhood is literally dying. They are evolving. They're beginning to understand that things aren't how they see it. Things are going to change. And we're supposed to then provide the space to kind of for them to try all those things out. But what we do again is try and make them conform, right? At this age, again, children's creativity is flowing. They're being all of these surges of hormones, and it's a good time for them to kind of like try out their ideas. If you were the parent of a teenager and you've ever booked a consultation with me, oftentimes I say to you that children are meant to be rebellious, yet they're meant to think they know everything, and they're meant to think that you don't understand. It's a good time to provide them the space to do that. Obviously, it's very, very difficult as a parent, but the main thing is to kind of focus on validating them and trusting that they will draw from that the values and the things that you instilled in them during early childhood. So that's why early childhood is really important, because no matter where they are, they're going to be influenced by their friends. They're not going to listen to you. What they will draw from is those early childhood experiences. And if they have positive, strong early childhood experiences, they will draw from that confidently. Now, because of the world that we live in today, young children during early childhood are spending more and more time away from home. And again, that is intentional to kind of remove the power from us as a community, as parents, as people who genuinely care and love these children, and to kind of bring them towards the state, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm not making any judgments if your child spends the majority of the waking time away from home. You just have to be aware and then be intentional about where you're sending your child during those times. So yeah, we all know that eventually teenagers mellow out, but the trick is to kind of flow with their development rather than trying to break them out of it, because that's ultimately the ideal that colonizers developed, right? And that we would then continue to sustain more of what exists today. We want children to continue what already exists rather than to create something new, rather than to break down these structures that don't work. We want them to conform, which is not helping, right? And that's what mass education does. And mass education socializes children into that. You know, the reality is that's why we haven't really seen that much progress in society as we have grown up, right? So when we were all young, we all felt like, yeah, we'd have flying cars by 2020, blah, 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 blah. And like, nothing's changed, just more chaos, right? So the reason why that is because of all of this kind of suppression of information and development, and the maintaining of power. So we have all been subject to the ideology of the state, and their whole goal is to maintain power and control. And you know, you can see this because they don't send their children to the same schools that they provide for our children. Overall point, right? The key takeaway is that we should flow with your children's natural development. And I believe that children are born with a particular type of energy that we should embrace, right? So some children have like a very nervous sort of bouncy energy. That have a whole bunch of energy, always bouncing off the walls, fighting, etc., right? And we've been socialized into seeing that behavior as undesirable, right? And we get told to put them on drugs to kind of mellow them out. But let's look at it differently. Let's look at it as if we were a functioning society, right, where communities were self-sufficient. Those children would be the warriors, right? We need warriors to protect our community. So what would happen in those communities is that they would, and this is what our ancestors did, right? They would accept that some children had warrior energy, and therefore they would be provided the space to harness and learn that energy. But because we've been socialized into kind of seeing the protection of our communities as the responsibility of the state, even though we all know that they don't give a damn about us and they would much rather kill us in a lot of instances than protect us, we've kind of given away that free will, that God-given free will, and we kind of told God that the warriors that He has given us to protect our communities are broken people. So as I said, that's how our ancestors viewed children prior to colonization, that there was nothing wrong with any child, and every child had a particular energy, and that energy would tell us as adults who they were. And it was our responsibility to guide that child correctly. Yeah, so let's stop seeing our children as good if they conform to colonial lenses of behaving well, right? It has always only ever served the colonizers. That leads me to my second question. What are the words that you hear when you hear the word parent, right? So for me, it's guide, director, protector, unconditional love, and acceptance. So based on the fact that I see children as competent, capable beings with their own journey, their own energy, their own purpose, etc., I see the role of the adult, the role of parents, as being guides for children through that. Sorry, pre-mass education, there was this view that people were not educated, which, as I said before, isn't true. They were just educated differently. So once you've identified that your child has warrior energy, for example, your child would be educated by the warriors in the community, right, at the right time. It would actually really start from when the child could walk. This doesn't mean that your baby is going to be like going out and going to war, but they would be in the company of warriors while they were training, who would educate the child from young, right? And the child would then learn basically everything through what it takes to be a warrior from when they were very young. We actually do something similar now, and what we call it is being led by the child's interest, right? And those interests could be anything. It could be agriculture, it could be art, spirituality, construction, literally anything. We need all of those things for functioning societies, and people can make a living from any of those things. We all grew up being told that you can't play games all day because you won't find a job, and now there are literally kids earning millions of pounds, dollars, etc., playing games online. So the role of a parent is to develop an understanding of your child's interests and their energy and their character, and then make it okay for them to express that, provide them with the guidance to do that, and to become like the best version of that, right? So in the next video, we're going to go through strategies that you can use to identify and monitor that. But the whole point is that as a parent, you should be intentional about every single opportunity that you provide for your child, every single environment that you send your child to. It should serve a purpose, and that purpose is honoring your child in their totality. You should be on the school's neck about what they are doing for your child, right? And then on top of that, you can be subsidizing their experience with other activities that don't have to be expensive. So, one of the people that I interact with often on Instagram started homeschooling her child and posted about her child wanting a uniform for homeschooling. And I suggest that she turns this into an activity where they can make a uniform, right? This type of activity can be taken. Hear my chicken. So this type of activity can be taken as deep as you want, or you can go as far as actually knitting the jumper. So yes, teaching your child how to knit. It doesn't mean that you have to know how to knit. You can literally use YouTube to learn how to knit together. In that act, you're teaching your child how to find information for themselves, how to take action. They're learning that to do anything, it takes practice, it takes time, and it takes patience. So with activities like this, because you don't have the constraints of one lesson, you can take all the time that you need, right? You are teaching your child colors, counting because they're counting the stitches, which colors go together and which don't, fine and gross motor skills, self-regulation. The list is literally endless. You don't have to be homeschooling to do this. This can be your evening/weekend or summer holidays activity. The whole point is, though, that to be intentional about shaping the different areas of a child's development according to who they are and what their interests are. So that is what I really view as the role of the parent. And then we're going to kind of move on to the next question, which is, what characteristics do you want your child to have? So the characteristics that you chose are ones that you have to be intentional about cultivating. So let's say you chose kind, right? Number one, how do you demonstrate kindness every single day so your child can see what it means to be kind? What it means, how do you actively teach a child kindness, especially as they don't actually have fully developed self-regulation skills yet? How are you kind to your child when they can't regulate their emotions, right? And then, like, what does it actually mean to be kind? And how do you be kind without betraying yourself? How do you teach your child to be kind to themselves? Do you say kind things about yourself, or are you constantly putting yourself down? So these are all kind of questions that you begin to unpick and think about, and how you're going to intentionally cultivate kindness in your child. So let's also say you use the word brave, right? What does it mean to be brave? Do you allow your child to take risks, or do you micromanage? Are you a helicopter parent? Do you reward them for taking risks, even if they fail at what they're trying to do? What do you even teach them about failure? Characteristics are cultivated in children, and they learn more from what they observe you doing than what you tell them to do. What I've noticed is a lot of time we reward children for the behaviors that we don't actually want without realizing, and punishing the behaviors that we want when we don't have awareness. I always say that many children do not receive direct, undivided attention from their parents unless they're getting told off. And that's something that I've noticed even more within our communities, and like, it's actually really sad, and we have to be intentional about this. What do I mean by this? Your child comes to you and says, "Mummy, Daddy, look what I have made," right? And because you're on your phone, you're like, "Oh, that's great," right? You're not even really paying attention. But then your child does something wrong, and then you sit them down, you look at them, "Why did you do this?" Blah, 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 right? Children need connection. They need all those things. So if the only time they're getting that undivided attention and connection is when they have done something wrong, what behavior are you rewarding? A lot of us are aware that there's loads of things after our kids, but the reality is those things, those people only have access to our children because a lot of our children's fundamental needs for love and connection are not being met by their parents, right? So let's say, for example, your child is super talkative, super expressive, etc., right? It can be super draining, especially after a really long day. But if you continue to make comments about your child being talkative, expressive, sharing their ideas, annoying, etc., they begin to internalize those messages and see it as there's something wrong with them, because their primary reference point, right, for unconditional love is making them feel as if that aspect of them is wrong. There's something wrong with them. So what happens is they end up kind of suppressing it, right, and they stop being themselves. That's actually why the first question was, what was your own childhood experiences? Because we all have childhood things that we're trying to heal from. And for better or worse, it shapes the way in which we interact with our children. So I didn't really talk about that at the beginning of this video. I kind of jumped straight into question 2. I think part of me really pushes for honoring children's selfhood and who they truly are and their individuality, because aspects of my own experiences left me kind of suppressing aspects of myself that I'm still trying to integrate into my life now. And I know a lot of people can identify with that. I know that isn't a unique experience, and a lot of us are in the same boat. I actually think it's a generational thing based on being raised by people who were also raised by people who did that, right? People who were raised by the silent generation, for example. And that's what I mean by different generations have different energies, right? A lot of us millennials, and more so Gen X's, are more outspoken. We are more embracive of people's individuality, speaking out against social issues, being concerned with the collective, embracing individuality. Did I say that? I think so. So this kind of drives the next question, right? What opportunities do you want your child to have? So in the previous video and earlier on in this video, I touched briefly on the concept of capital, habitus, and field. So remember, the field is a social space, the habitus is the rules of that space, and capital is basically your entry ticket. You can have an entry ticket, but you don't know the habitus, so you won't survive, or rather your child won't survive when they have access to that space. So the opportunities that you want your child to have, you have to be intentional about gaining capital and learning the habitus of that so that you can transmit that information to your own child. So this is where your own capital, aka your networks, come in. Rich people do this thing where they basically rotate their children among themselves. And what I mean by that is, if your child is like 12, 13, 14, whatever, at least some of their summer holidays could be spent shadowing different people in different fields to kind of broaden their horizons, right? They can go to different clubs that are outside of your reach, outside of your comfort zone, where one, they can form their own networks and gain other forms of capital, begin to learn the rules of other fields that they might be interested in. One of the ways that this plays out that I can talk about is a majority of people don't know how university works, right? So right now I've noticed a lot of people on social media talking about how university is a waste of time, waste of money, etc. And to be honest, it's only a waste of time and money if you don't know how to navigate it. And yes, you will 100% waste your £9,250 per year. And the whole thing is that whole narrative is actually being pushed because it's part of an agenda to kind of stop common people from accessing university, but that's a whole other story. It wasn't actually until I started working in academia that I really began to understand how the system worked, right? I have a whole section in my thesis about this, but in general, the idea is that university was never really designed for common folk. Universities in its new sense, right? Definitely wasn't designed for Black working class people, right? And we don't have the generational knowledge on how to use it, how to implement it, how to navigate that space. So although through different policies and stuff like that, we have gained access to that space, because we lack the knowledge of the rules or the habitus of how to navigate that space, we don't get as much out of it as people whose parents, great-grandparents, etc. have been to university and understand how university works. I'm going to do a whole video about this before the end of the summer, especially as people are preparing for university. So if there is anything specific that you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. Yeah, and obviously make sure that you're following, etc., so that you can watch that video. If your child or somebody that you know, or even yourself as an adult, is starting university soon and you want to discuss this in more depth, you can book a session on my website. So the takeaway, though, is that how are you going to make sure that you're giving your child a head start in whichever field they're going into, whether that's academia, sports, etc. The opportunities that we are talking about here is global, right? So expand your mind, connect to your global community, but with the goal of African liberation in mind. We have to be intentional about teaching our children our history, the reality of the world, and then providing them with the skills and the confidence to navigate it. So as I said, I believe that every child has their own path to walk, and we can only really be a guide, right? The harsh reality is we can guide all we want, and the child can still make the choice to reject it all. There's nothing we can do about that. All we can do is our best. So the last question was, what are your values, your strengths, and your weaknesses? The question is, where do you begin to see where you can provide capital for your child and yourself? right? And where you might need to outsource those forms of capital. If your child is super active and has warrior energy and you aren't really like that, it is hard, right? But you can find someone or an activity where your child can have that outlet. Let's say some sort of martial arts, right? So I know that spelling and grammar is not my thing, not my strong point. So I don't even try and teach that, to be honest. Like, I have literally been asked to teach study skills sessions on this, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not the one, right? So I have no issues with that. I have no qualms with that. So as a parent, between you as parents, whether you are parents that are parenting together, whether you are co-parenting, or even if you're a single parent, identifying what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then using your extended network, we outsource the development of those skills, knowledges, whatever, for your child, right? If you don't have a support network, as I said, you can outsource, speak to teachers, neighbors, clubs, or join the village. So the other part of the question was about your core values, right? So one of my core values is that for the liberation of all of us collectively includes speaking out against all forms of oppression, educating individuals on ways in which they can navigate spaces that honors their own personhood. So that kind of all informs my work and everything that I am doing here and everything that I have coming. So as a parent, I want you to see yourself as an architect, right? As a builder of your child's development. You are building your child's development brick by brick, experience by experience, day by day, moment by moment, right? I mentioned this last week that there is an increase in people pushing this narrative that parents have minimal impact on their children's outcomes, which is just not true. There is a whole agenda to try and minimize parents' roles in their lives. And it really, really irritates me. It really, really bothers me because it just socializes or continues to reinforce this idea that we should just give up our children to the state, right? It is true that there are loads and loads of variables, loads of things that you can't control. But the thing that you can undoubtedly control is giving your child a secure base, shaping their internal voice that they will carry around with them for the rest of their life. I think within our communities, we have been socialized even more to just kind of entrusting our children to professionals, doctors, nurses, teachers, police, the state, etc., throughout the generations. And I think it really started with us millennials, where we began to really question that, right? We have seen that we can't trust them explicitly, which is nice, but the automated behaviors that we have developed sometimes leaving us like we don't really have options. And when things kind of go wrong, we do kind of automatically go running back. So for me, it's about developing those systems that we can have these solutions within our communities, right? So your parenting philosophy, coupled with your knowledge and understanding of everything that we're talking about and what you're effectively fighting against, will help you to navigate the world with your child in a way that aligns with your values, and then gives them the tools to do so alone when they are ready. So when they're old enough, when they're experienced enough, when you're no longer around. The reality is there are loads of child development books out there that tell you what your child should be doing by here and by then and this, that, and the other. And I'm sure you've read some of them or done other bits of research. So my series is not really going to go into that. What I will say is that it's important to just remember that all you are doing is building on your child's development. You can only ever really go according to their pace and what they are ready to learn and what they're ready to do, right? So from next week, that's what we're going to be focusing on. But I want to tell you a story. So I remember I completed a development check with one of my friends during COVID, and it was a time where they sent these 2.5-year checks to homes and parents had to kind of fill it out. And I have been criticizing these things for years, right? In academic circles, we've been criticizing it before it even came out. So yeah, I have lots of feelings about that thing. But one of the questions, or one of the development checks, is if a child can walk downstairs 1 foot at a time. And I think this is one of the most ridiculous development checks, because that's something that only a child who lives in a house with a staircase is able to do confidently. If a child lives in a flat or lives in a house that hasn't got a staircase, like a bungalow, they don't have the opportunities to practice that as often, right? So that isn't really a measure of development on its own, because that's circumstantial, and all of development is circumstantial. I want you to understand that as long as your child is developing, building on what they already know, what they can already do, and improving getting stronger, etc., day by day, then they're fine, right? When you learn how to watch your child closely, understand what's happening in all areas of their development, that's physical, cognitive, language, communication, social, and spiritual, then you are able to support them with the next layer of bricks. That's how you build strong foundation for development, and that's what we're going to be talking about in the next video. So now we have reached the end of the video. I don't know what's going on, sorry. We've reached the end of the video, so please, if you've made it to this point, say hello down below or drop a green heart, something. Let me know that you've made it to the end of this video. Please let me know your thoughts and your feedback. And in the next video, we're going to be talking about how to nurture your children's development. Okay, so thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next week.